Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's great to be with you all today. I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to be having today with a great guest. I just want to plug, we've got a bunch of stuff coming up. My studio or streaming space is finally fixed, so I'm back in it, and we've got stuff lined up this week. Today, we're going to be talking to Mark Neocleous, which I'm really looking forward to. We have a conversation with James Kilgore on international solidarity on Thursday. Orasanmi Burton is going to be back on Friday for, to wrap up our discussion on Frank Kitson's Low Intensity Operations book. We have a conversation on the Congo that I need to get on the schedule. I'll try to do that later today, but that's going to be Sunday evening. And M2 Gant will be back next Tuesday to wrap up our discussion of Cedric Robinson's Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. So, of course, with the news last night and everything, I do need to get some more things scheduled on Palestine and Yemen. So keep an eye out on that. So we're going to have a lot that's coming out for folks. I'm excited about that. And I look forward to bringing these conversations, engaging with you all. So before I introduce our guests, take a moment, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, support us on Patreon if you do not already. And, really importantly, just share this conversation with folks, invite people into this discussion. Without further ado, our guest is Mark Neocleous. He is a professor of the critique of political economy in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Brunel in London. He is a critical theorist who focuses on questions of state and capital, especially as they pertain to police, security, and war, with an interest in the political imagination, especially concerning bodies, monstrosity, subjectivity, fear, and death. He's the author of a whole bunch of books, a few of them: Fascism, The Politics of Immunity, A Critical Theory of Police Power, War Power, Police Power, The Universal Adversary, and The Monstrous and the Dead, just to name a few. Today, we're going to be talking about his latest book, which just came out. It's called Pacification, Social War, and the Power of Police. So without further ado, Mark, welcome to the stage. It's good to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, hello, Jared. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of our guests over the years and the authors that we've engaged with your work pretty extensively. We recently did a conversation with Andrew Krinks on his book White Property, Black Trespass, which definitely draws upon some of your work. Orasanmi Burton, who we've talked to a few times over the years, draws upon your work, and so it's really great to be in conversation with you. And we a lot of our conversations, one of our interests on this podcast is counterinsurgency, for sure. And a lot of that we've engaged more so in a kind of modern context, whether that's thinking about the 60s and the 70s and kind of some of that literature that comes out of the state responses to the anti-colonial movements. Or more modern than that, Kilcullen or the counterinsurgency field manual that comes out of the U.S. military. But you focus on the term pacification, and I kind of want to just start and talk about that a little bit. I mean, you draw back a very kind of long history of this, and so maybe you could talk a little bit about that process of going back through that. I mean, you definitely look at Rome and the Romans. You also look at Greek society quite a bit in this text. So just talk a little bit about that, like some of the kind of origin points and thinking about pacification with that longer arc.
Yeah, sure, of course. As you know, one of the things I do in the book is to try and work with the idea of pacification as a way of thinking about counterinsurgency, but not, if you like, reducing it to counterinsurgency. And one of the reasons for that is that pacification has a much longer history and a much richer history. And another reason for it is because when counterinsurgency is invented as an idea in the early 1960s, and then takes off as an idea, one of the interesting things about the literature of that period is it constantly, the practitioners and the theorists are constantly asking the question, what do we mean by counterinsurgency? What do we do when we do counterinsurgency? And it's remarkable the number of times that they will say, well, we're kind of doing pacification, aren't we? And so even the counterinsurgency theorists, the Coindinistas, as I like to call them, constantly fall back on this idea of pacification. That yes, we're doing counterinsurgency, but this is really what we've been doing for a much longer time scale, and it was called pacification. And even in that counterinsurgency manual, the U.S. Army Marines counterinsurgency manual, it's interesting that at some point they pause the text and go, this is kind of pacification. And it only takes place over a couple of pages, but the fact that it's there tells you something important, I think, about what's going on in the mind of counterinsurgency thinkers when they're talking about counterinsurgency. But to go back to the history, it's, I mean, one of the things that struck me was the remarkable rise of interest in the idea of pacification amongst thinkers and theorists with the rise of capitalism and early modernity, and thinking about the early modern state. The term itself has a long history that goes back to the Romans, as you mentioned. But the Romans, talk about the idea of pacifying a people, of keeping them down, keeping them in order, knowing how to maintain a certain kind of order, and so forth. And that idea trundles along, and then suddenly there's a real spike of interest in what might be done with this idea. And that part of that is about the colonial project. In other words, it starts when imperial powers are colonizing the globe, but a lot of it is about how you constitute order in the newly emerging social order of what becomes capitalism, and how the state that's going to emerge from monarchy goes about constituting precisely that order. In other words, it's not simply a colonial idea or an imperial idea. It resonates across the whole process of systematic colonization. So I was struck by this idea of pacification, and I think that once you connect counterinsurgency with pacification, I think the onus is really on us to think about pacification rather than counterinsurgency, because if you just stick with counterinsurgency, you might lose that rich conceptual history. You might lose some of the insights that are revealed to us in some of that pacification literature. What I try to do with it is say, okay, let's take seriously this literature. It's basically the ruling class and its key thinkers, key theorists, telling us what they think they're doing when they are constituting an order that we now know as capitalism. So what I'm trying to do by building on that rich history is to, if you like, make pacification a key concept for critical thinking about capitalism and the state.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that always stands out when I read stuff from this literature is the kind of view of the subject that exists within pacification or counterinsurgency, literature. Um, the because I think on one level we're sort of taught, like, if you want to make change, you have to do social movements and, sometimes protests, and that it might not just be through, simply voting. And yet when I read the counterinsurgency literature, they're like, no, you vote for somebody and then you give up all of your power and you can't do anything else. Like, anything else is dangerous, is a potential threat. Um, and I know you write in this text about the Greek concept of stasis quite a bit too, and how this kind of gets like taken out of the theory of democracy or the state as time goes on. Um, and I wanted you to talk about this a little bit about like how they kind of view the subject and its role and what they don't want the subjects doing.
Mm, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that for the counterinsurgency thinkers, for the thinkers and practitioners of pacification, the vote is the key, is the kind of key and more or less only moment of collective will formation. And once that vote is cast, then that collective will can be dissolved back into the atomized individuals, and we should all just go about our business. In other words, a government has been formed, and one should now obey. And I think what's behind your question is the idea that is alien to the Greek concept of stasis, which I talk about in the book. Yeah. So I'm kind of, I mean, what I try and do with that idea is it's a very intriguing idea, and it's very, very difficult to translate. And it's difficult to translate because for the Greeks it's distinct from the concept of polemos, which is about war. But it was integral to the Greek order, to the point where the Constitution of Athens, that was said to be written by Aristotle, has this idea that all citizens should participate in stasis, and those who don't participate in stasis should be banished. They're no longer citizens. And this is remarkable, right? Because stasis is essentially conflict. It's what we would now call social conflict. So translations of stasis tend to, at the very least, we got translated as faction. Sometimes it's translated as sedition, often as civil strife, but then also as civil war. And none of these quite get to what's going on with the Greeks, which is this idea that somehow there is this fundamental conflict at the heart of social order that is part of what it means to be part of a polis, to be part of a polity, to be part of an order. And that wasn't without its problems. So, Plato constantly is talking about how we need to stamp out stasis without having any ideas about how to do it, other than telling the people stories and so forth. And Aristotle conjures up all sorts of ways in which stasis might be managed in such a way that it doesn't destroy the social order. But what was important is that ultimately they didn't really think you could get beyond it or outside it. And what happens through the centuries is that with the rise of early modernity, there's an issue, which is, well, we can look back to the ancient Greeks for a lot of our ideas and our political principles, but stasis is deeply, deeply problematic, which is why you get these translations. So classically, as I talk about in the book, Hobbes's first major work was, in many ways, his translation of Thucydides, and he does something important with the translation of stasis. He doesn't translate it as civil war. That comes a bit later in Hobbes's work, but he does translate it as faction and, importantly, sedition. And the point about that is that once you start talking about things as seditious, then they become things to be countered, right? Because the seditious person is by definition an insurgent, is by definition disorderly, rebellious, revolutionary, and therefore it has to be stamped out. So it's quite amazing that this ancient Greek idea, through the centuries, through the Roman translation of stasis into the idea of constitution, and then eventually with the rise of early modernity, it gets eradicated. Of course, that doesn't mean that social conflict ends. Quite the opposite, right? It carries on, and then the question is, what do we name it? And maybe we might want to talk about that a little bit if you want to.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, so before we go further, I do want to talk about just constitution, because I think that it's one of those terms that a lot of us I don't think about it that much in terms of like what does this mean, right? It's like, oh, well, this is a set of sort of foundational laws and principles of a society, so on. But you talk about it, you write, quote, a power could only be constituted as a state, that part's is in italics, if it was seen as a solution to the problem of seditious factions and insurgencies within the wider order, end quote. And so could you just talk a little bit about this kind of original meaning of constitution here, and kind of what it tells us about the role or the function of the state and the role of law here?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, well, Americans in particular are very good at talking about the Constitution, right? But you're not alone, of course. But that's the way modern minds are meant to think about about Constitution, because we've been educated into thinking about Constitution in that way by the liberal state, and then the liberal democratic state, and this idea of this document that we can describe as the Constitution. But actually, it's a very modern way of thinking about this idea, and in its early forms, it actually refers much more to a process of the constitution of a particular order. Now, we still use the idea we still use the word in that way sometimes, of course, but we don't think about the Constitution as a process. We think about it often as a fixed document, right, that mustn't ever be changed or challenged, or can only be changed or challenged with incredibly long processes in place. So what I'm interested in the book is this idea of the constitution of an order, and the idea that as the modern state emerges, it emerges as a force that can constitute an order through the eradication of seditious movements or practices or ideas. In other words, I'm kind of, I guess I'm less interested in what most people now think of as, if you like, the order of the Constitution, and much more about the constitution of order, with the constitution of order being alluding to the idea that this is a process, and it's a process that, as I try and argue in the book, is rooted in this idea of treating enemies of the order as a fundamental problem that need to be either eradicated or at least countered. And of course, I guess part of that is what gets connected to that idea of the modern state as constituting an order is that that project, in that project, the modern state, if you like, sets out its stall as constituting the order of peace, right? In other words, the state, we will constitute this order of peace and, of course, security by eradicating the seditious elements, by eradicating the problematic elements, by stopping the enemy. And of course, what that does is it generates in a sense, the fundamental tension within this modern order, which is how do you simultaneously constitute an order that you define as peace, while simultaneously constantly identifying one enemy after the other, which is what I try and get to when I in the book I play off the idea of civil war against social war, and how modern political thought and the modern state sets itself out against civil war, so because we're for peace, right? And so what the state does is it constitutes a peaceful social order, and therefore the first task of any state is to eradicate civil war, and yet simultaneously declares one war after the other. Yeah, the war on the seditious, the war on factions, the war on rebellious, the war on masterless men, the war on, and then we get the much more modern wars, the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on shirkers, the war on scroungers, the war on strikers, the war on so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah. Let's go there a little bit deeper there for just a second. I mean, so you write quite a bit about Thomas Hobbes. You know, he's obviously very important to you know, the modern state and our theories around it. Um, and you know, you write about his own fears and, you know, his own kind of obsession with civil war. As well, you know, and you situate that within the context of his life, which I thought was really, you know, obviously both good scholarship, but interesting. And you know, as you said, he does this. He has this process through which he kind of seeks to replace civil war with a state of kind of permanent social war, as you would articulate it. So, say just talk a little bit about Hobbes in this, and also just that this, you know, because you kind of trace where this like kind of obsession with avoiding civil war kind of becomes the kind of one of the dominant themes of what it means to have a state, what it means to, you know, you know, to constitute a state and so on.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously you've picked up on my um, well, I'm almost tempted to use the word obsession with Hobbes. I keep coming back to Hobbes, you know, time and again. I do find him very fascinating, intellectually, politically, but also in a sense personally, which I touch on in the book. You know, I mean, he was a man who suffered from many, as we moderns would call them, insecurities, right? And they come out in a lot of his work. But yeah, I mean, I take Hobbes, also to a lesser extent Locke, as kind of emblematic thinkers of the early modern bourgeois state, in different ways. Obviously, they are different in all sorts of ways, but they do share some fundamental ideas. And one of those ideas is the idea that if the modern state is anything, then it is an apparatus for ending civil war, right? And that becomes key to the whole of modern thinking about state power, right? And so for Hobbes, if you know, the danger of civil war is that it is chaos, it is a collapse of the state. It is, some Hobbes scholars will say, well, for Hobbes, civil war is a return to the state of nature. That essentially the existence of a civil war means that the state is gone. And of course, you find this repeated in contemporary debates about contemporary civil wars. But I guess what I was interested in talking about Hobbes and others to a lesser extent, such as Locke, is the ways in which, in the very process of making that argument, they very, very quickly get to an internal enemy. And the first enemy to be identified, if you take Locke, for example, is the criminal, right? The criminal is at war with society, is more or less an exact quote from Locke. And of course, that still resonates now, right? We are still, you know, several hundred years later, we are still somehow fighting the war on crime, right? And so what interested me in relation to that early period and early thinking about the state was this simultaneous disavowal of civil war, but a kind of an avowal of what they won't call civil war, but what they will call war. So what I try and do in the book is to pursue this idea of social war, and this is a word, this is a term that I think, well, I think is useful. I think is useful for a number of reasons. One is because that's precisely what they're talking about. The other is it's a term that some Marxists touched on, but didn't really develop very much. Engels, for example, liked the idea, but never really worked with it at any great length. Marx, in contrast, stayed with this idea of the idea of civil war, trying to connect actual civil wars with the class war. So he was clearly thinking, I need to think about class war as civil war. And you get this idea in various places, but he doesn't do very much about it. And what I try and do is to say, well, actually, the problem is, well, partly the problem with civil war is, as a category, is that it has kind of been taken up and dominated by military legal thinkers, right? To the point where they will, seek to define precisely what civil war is. The other thing is, I think, when Marxists try and connect class war with civil war, it often just doesn't work very well, in the sense that there's this constant problem that Marx had, which is, when Marx tries to think about the American Civil War in relation to class war, it's interesting, but it gets into all sorts of problematic areas. And the same is true of a lot of the ways in which Marxists think about contemporary civil wars. And what it doesn't deal with is the whole gamut of social wars, which I think intersect with the class war in all sorts of far more interesting ways. The war on poverty being an obvious example, the war on scroungers, the war on benefits cheats, and so on and so forth, right? One war after another, one war after another. And these, I think, do intersect with the class war in interesting ways, in terms of constituting a certain kind of order or fabricating a certain kind of order, and in particular an order of wage labor and an order of kind of good subjects, citizens as good subjects. And the other thing about it is that, these are wars that are interestingly declared by the ruling class, right? The ruling class of capitalist society, which tells us constantly that it is on the side of peace, never stops announcing one war after another. And I think we need to take that seriously. I think what I try and do in the book is to take that seriously, right? What is going on in the minds of these thinkers? And we can take this back to the idea of pacification, if you like, right? Where they're constantly going, right, we're for peace, we're on the side of peace, 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 and yet declaring one war after another. The language of war, that slips so easily from the tongues of the practitioners of peace, supposedly.
Absolutely. So one of the obsessions that these folks seem to have too, thinking about thinkers of pacification, is always segmenting out different portions of the population from one another. And in particular, you talk about, this obsession with the seditious faction of society and kind of how to keep them away from people that they might influence, right? And so there's a couple phrases you use: the seditious faction and the giddy rabble. I will say about this book and about your work, you do a lot of really interesting work around language and around, the histories of words, etymology, and so on. It's just very interesting just in and of itself. But, giddy is a term I think of as just, silly and, kind of we're having fun, and that, we're all kind of, maybe we've stayed up too late and we're watching something funny and we're laughing for no reason. But, this idea. So say a little bit more about the giddy rabble, and also maybe a little bit about these, this constant thing, which I think is a theme that continues throughout counterinsurgency literature, which is sort of like there's one enemy within domestic, within our country. There's always a kind of internal enemy that's seditious, that's against us, and we have to make sure that they don't influence too many people.
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, the giddy rebel is a lovely phrase, right? From the 17th century. I'm just thinking about your where you went with it, which was to go, I think of giddy as being silly, right? And you meant silly in the fun sense, right? Or I've had a couple of drinks, I'm feeling a bit giddy, you know, giggling kind of, yeah? That's where you were going with the idea of silly. But of course, there's another way in which we can think about silly, which picks up on what was going on with the idea of the giddy rabble in the 17th century, which is silly as stupid, right? As in properly stupid. And that's where the giddy of the 17th century is directing people, right? It's the rabble, and they are giddy in the sense that they are stupid. And they're also giddy in the sense that giddy people, in the way that you mean it, are giddy, which is they are silly enough to be misled or led astray by the various seditious factions. In other words, their minds are a bit, just weak-minded. And yeah, I mean, I did like the term. I'd never really thought about it before, and so, and you're right, I do like that. Those etymological themes, they do come out. I think for me, what's going on there is, how do you police the people? How do you manage the people? And to know that, you have to know who the people are. And the people in the 17th century is not clear. But for some, it is clear in the sense that they will regard, the white propertied male as constituting the people. But then you've got a problem, which is what are all these other people? And some of them can be described as the giddy rabble, and the giddy rabble might just be left alone to get on with its giddiness, but it can be led astray, and it can be led astray by intellectuals, dissidents, people who think too much, people who read too much, people who think that they should have a say in how government is constituted and how government is run, and so forth. And so there's this question of, how do you manage this relationship between, what should we call them, dissident intellectuals and the mass, right? The giddy rabble, and that's one of the fundamental problems of pacification, right? How do you constitute the people as obedient subjects, and as obedient subjects as individuals, and as an obedient population as a mass? And how do you continue to police it, given that there are all constantly these seditious thinkers coming along and trying to fill the minds of the mass with these crazy ideas, whatever the crazy ideas might be? So that's where I was going with the giddy rabble. You asked there was another side to your question, which I can't now remember. What was it?
Well, just this, I mean, I think you've kind of touched on it, but they're always, like, in more modern ones, right? They would say some version of, there's the radicals, right? There's the idealists, there's the moderates, right? And then they do these exercises in terms of, how do we separate out these different segments of the population? How do we, ensure that, to use the old one, the giddy rabble doesn't fall in with these with the seditious faction, right? Or follow them. And, in more modern, they're thinking about, the ways that they think people think about things. And, we go after the idealists in this way. And if we get them, then we can convince the moderates, and, this kind of thing. And I mean, it's just it's sort of a divide and conquer strategy always. But, yeah, I don't know. It just came to me as we were talking about the seditious faction with the giddy rabble, that, like, this is kind of an early version of that same, way of approaching, policing and the management of society, I guess.
Yeah, and there are different ways in which that can be done, right? I mean, you can engage in some straightforward repression of the seditious factions, you can burn them at the stake, or you can just dump them in the universities.
Right. Right. Um, so I want to move to this concept of the securiotic subject, the security subject. So I know you've done more work on this. You're part of a collective that wrote the Security Abolition Manifesto, which folks can, I'll link it in the show description, but you can get a free PDF as well as purchasing it. And so I know this is something that you've thought about the concept of security a lot in a lot of your work. But you write about this as kind of the securiotic subject as the pacified ideal. And contrary to some other thinkers and activists that you cite, you argue that security only becomes conjoined with the concept of insecurity in the modern era with capitalism, really. And so just talk a little bit about this subject and, and this idea of that security centered subject as the pacified ideal. I think it really gives a clear idea of kind of all the kinds of subjects that are treated as threats or even enemies. Pacification has a clear idea, right, of all these different ideas of what's a threat and what's an enemy. But this is where you're kind of getting to what do they actually want from a subject, I think. What are they looking for there?
Mm. Well, I guess the short answer to that is what capitalism wants is insecure subjects, which is why insecurity as an idea is invented with capitalism. And what the state wants is insecure subjects, which is why the state constantly talks about itself as the security apparatus. So, yeah, this idea of the securiotic subject, I mean, we talk about it at more length than I do in Pacification. We talk about it in the Security Abolition Manifesto that you mentioned, and there we play with different ideas. One of the things we do is we talk about Kafka's short story, The Burrow, which is about an animal which is usually described as a mole. And the mole makes a burrow, a home, and gets in the burrow and is nice and comfy in their nice, lovely, warm home, and then thinks that it can hear noises, and it thinks, well, there's noises. Where are the noises? The noises they seem to be coming from up above the ground. No, hold on, they seem to be coming from below the ground, below the burrow. And no, hold on. It almost sounds like they're inside the burrow. And so the mole starts engaging in improving its security apparatus for the home, and constantly checking. Right, I better go outside and check where the noises are coming from. I better go a burrow further and see if there's any further noises below. I better double check the burrow. And it gets to the point where the mole ends up sitting outside the burrow, keeping an eye on the burrow because he's worried about the security of the burrow, because the burrow is supposed to be his home, and so its home. So the burrow is so the mole ends up being a kind of a security guard for the security of the home that was built for the security of the mole, i.e. the guard. And we use it as a way of trying to capture us, right? We're constantly having to think about security, which means that we are constantly being reminded of our insecurities, which affect us all in one way or the other, to the point at which we are all interpolated as securiotic subjects, or what we call securiotic subjects, which is not an easy word. That the manifesto is being translated into several languages, and the amount of trouble that the various languages have had to translate securiotic, I won't even begin to describe to you. But yeah, and we're trying to get. And so in terms of the pacification book, what I try and do there is to actually try and think about the ways in which security operates as pacification. That the constant iteration of security, and of course, in that sense, insecurity, facilitates the whole pacification process. That we become pacified subjects by living as securotic subjects. That our securoses contribute fundamentally to our pacification. And you mentioned something about the history there. I mean, what I try and do is to explore the ways in which security has a much longer history than insecurity. The complexities of that history, that for centuries security is a sin for Christians, right? Because if you think you're in security, then you haven't understood that security only comes with God, right? And the ways in which this connects security to death in all sorts of complicated ways, such that when modern thinkers about the state and pacification start thinking about security, one of the things they pitch against security is not insecurity, it's fear, and in particular fear of death. So I think that, and that's one of the reasons I think a lot of the time, writing and thinking about security is a writing and thinking about death, and I try and put that center stage in the book by arguing that maybe part of it, if we're thinking about liberation, and honestly I don't know what that means right now in today, right? But if we're thinking about it, then maybe we need kind of radical rethinking about death.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. I think it's just a really fruitful area to think about. I mean, I know right now, like in the United States context where I am, obviously, the government, the Trump government, is doing all kinds of things that would make people insecure, right? He's
Yeah.
constantly producing, these kind of, whether it's green card holders being afraid of being deported, whether it's whether it's people who are working within the university fearing losing their jobs because of speaking out about, and a lot of the insecurity is associated with dissent, right? Is like a specific kind of relationship of like, if you step out of line and challenge us on these things, like we don't actually care if there are, laws or rights that we're supposed to pay attention to. We're going to do things to make you fear that something's going to be done to you anyways, that it doesn't,
Sure.
there's nothing that's going to protect you. And it does, it becomes very challenging, I think, as a person to not fall victim to, well, gosh, I need to do what I need to do to kind of make sure that I keep getting my paycheck, or that I keep, I can pay my mortgage, or whatever it is, pay rent, and I know you do get into more of this with debt later on, so we'll get back to that. But I want to go back to what you were talking about too, of this relationship with death. So you write that that security ultimately is a system for the manufacture of corpses, and further that security is a system for the manufacture of the enemy that figures as both patient and corpse, which is just very interesting. So, of course, the agents of security would argue that they, defend our freedom, right? Or that we owe our freedom to them for making those sacrifices or hard choices on our behalf. But obviously, as you're pointing out, really what we're talking about is a constant kind of insecurity and death making that's also going on there. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about these themes within your work, within the book and your work.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why, I mean, for a long time now, I've been, pushing Marx's insight into insight that, security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society. And as I think you're suggesting, that's why security becomes the legitimizing idea of so much violence, right? That this has to be done because we're doing it in the name of security. And I think, I mean, we can look at this in different in different ways. I mean, one is I was struck by an observation that John Stockwell makes in the Praetorian Guard. John Stockwell was an ex-CIA, I think, director. I might be wrong, but senior CIA member. I quote it in Critique of Security from, blimey, 20 years ago or so now, nearly 20 years ago. And so he at one point in the book, he starts totting up the number of deaths that he thinks the CIA might have been responsible for in his period within the organization. And if we assume that, you know, if we take for the moment, take as read the idea that the CIA exists to make Americans secure, right, to offer security to Americans, and of course they would say the whole globe, right? He does a totting up, and he goes, well, there's, you know, there's this place and this place and this place, and he comes up with the figure of 6 million. So, that's a lot of people, right?
That's a lot, yeah.
Some might call this genocide, right? So you can look at it in those ways, right? There's this mass production of corpses. You can also look at it in a different way, right? You can think about, I mean, you know, when Marx says security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society, he finishes the sentence, it runs something like, security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society, the concept of police. You know, and if you think about the number of deaths at the hands of police officers, like uniformed police officers, professional police officers, right? You know, it's amazing, right? You can top them up, right? In terms of, and it has been done by various organizations. You know, deaths at the moment of a stop and search, or deaths at the moment of an arrest, or deaths in police custody, all in the name of security, right? And almost all of them of people that most people aren't feeling that insecure about, right? In other words, you know that person over there selling single cigarettes is not making me feel insecure, right? You know, that person over there possibly using a dodgy $20 bill isn't making me feel insecure, right? To use two examples from the last, you know, number of killings in the US. So, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about this. You can think about it in relation to the security apparatus in terms of organizations like the CIA. You can think about it in relation to police. But the other way is I think a broader one that connects to us, and what it is that is rendering us insecure, and at the end of that is, I think, the fear that we might die having not led a fulfilled life, having not realized ourselves as, whatever you want to call it, creative, autonomous human beings flourishing with others and for others and through others. You know, that there's something about capitalism that stunts us, and we know that. And so part of our fear of death, I think, is rooted in the fact that we know that there is something unfulfilling about this life, and that renders us deeply, deeply insecure, and it encourages us to turn ourselves towards the things that are offered to us as giving us security, whether that's the state apparatus or this commodity or that commodity or that, yeah. And they don't have to be directly security commodities, right? Buy this new big lock to put on your front door, buy this camera to put on the front of your door. They can be all sorts of commodities that are supposed to make us feel that little bit more secure, you know. I'm doing an interview, I must buy a nice shirt.
Yeah, right. No, I appreciate that. So I want to talk about, because as you talk about, I mean, it's interesting. Like a lot of when you get to counterinsurgency literature, a lot of it kind of self-referentially ties itself back to colonial wars quite often. Um, and to thinking about, this phase of like, how do we manage a colony? How do we, stop you know, a seditious faction within the colony and so on, right? And one of the things I appreciate about your book is that you're drawing a much bigger arc, and you're connecting to you're kind of you talk about all the kind of liberal myths that get exploded by the prose of pacification, to use the phrase that Brendan McQuaid uses. And one of them is this kind of metropole colony, these kind of bifurcations that exist, or Sami Burton talks about, foreign versus domestic, and the problems with these kind of, things, and thinking about, which I think is partly influenced by your work and thinking about police and soldiers, and this, sort of false dichotomy. And one of the things that you draw upon is the early stages of the anti-colonial struggles in Algeria, and this coinciding with the Paris Commune, which was a connection that I don't remember having really come across before, thinking about before, in kind of a productive tension with each other. So could you talk about that a little bit, and why you wanted to include that in the book, and the meaning of it to you?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, I was using it as an example. I think there is a series of examples that maybe I could have organized differently in the book, which try and capture the ways in which it's not about there and here, it's not about the colony and the metropole, it's not about something boomeranging from one back to the other, that it's a unity, and it's a unity in the minds of the pacification thinkers and theorists and practitioners. And it's a unity that I think Marx was trying to get at when he used this phrase systematic colonization, that he was interested in the systematic colonization of the world by capital. How is productive labor fabricated? And it takes different forms in different contexts, but it is a unity. That's the problem. Right, that's the problem that capitalism has. It's a problem that the state, therefore, has to manage, has to police. And I think one of the things that comes out of the pacification, the prose of pacification, is that they recognize that unity in a way that adopting the more entrenched kind of liberal notion of here and there, foreign and domestic, colony, metropole, and so forth. Creates a problem for people who use those dichotomies, because they're constantly going, well, what's the relationship? What's the relationship? And I think the prose of pacification knows what the relationship is, right? It's how do you constitute capitalism? How do you fabricate wage labor? How do you get obedient subjects going to work, earning a wage, and therefore creating wealth? Yeah, they know it. So you've got, Frank Kitson behind you, I think, right over your left shoulder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank Kitson, yeah, he talks a lot about what the Brits are doing in the various colonies, but he's not shy of coming back to industrial warfare in the cities of the United Kingdom, right? It's the
No,
same
he talks.
process.
He's
It's the
like, this is
same.
what the army has to do within the
Yeah,
state, within the government.
yeah,
these are the people we need to talk to
yeah.
plan this stuff out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that means that soldiers will sometimes be doing something that might be called community policing, right? But then community policing might be done by police forces, but that's because police forces are fighting a war, right? They're engaged in low intensity operations, or if you prefer, pacification. Yeah. So that's the beauty. That's one of the reasons I wanted to spend a lot of time in the official documents, the police literature, the army literature, the pacification texts, because I think they're quite revealing, right? They're not talking about boomeranging from here and there, or they're not talking about practicing the X over there and then bringing it back home, right? It's like, no, we've got a problem, which is how do you constitute a capitalist order? What does the state need to do in order to fabricate productive labor, right? And so, in a sense, I think they see something that a lot of leftists have kind of not recognized, right? They've a lot of that literature, that critical literature, trying to be critical literature, has adopted a whole series of liberal dichotomies or conceptual couplets that then generate a whole heap of debates about, well, okay, we've got these two things, and now what's their relationship? And I think actually what the prose of pacification does is go, it's not two things, right? We keep telling you it's not two things. Why don't you listen to us? And so one of the things I try and do there is to go, okay, yeah, let's take them at their word, right? They seem to know what they're talking about.
I appreciate that a lot. That's great. So yeah, let's move into a little bit more into the more modern era a little bit. And you bring up this idea of the kind of soft colonialism concept and its influence within pacification literature. That's in air quotes. Soft colonialism.
Yeah.
And this idea of how pacification kind of markets itself as a positive or maybe even progressive, a developmentalist project. This idea of kind of this. There's this prose of building within this literature, and you also bring in this idea of the oil stain theory. And so, this stuff is really interesting to me. I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about, kind of this other, because there's certain. We've talked a lot about insecurity, right? And then there's also this aspect of pacification that's like, we're going to do things for you that will help make your life easier, or that's the way it sells it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in a sense, this picks up on one of the things that we were talking about in relation to constitution, right? The process of constituting something, right? Which in the modern version that you're picking up on, it becomes a building project. And you get connected ideas such as progressive. You get progressive pacification or benevolent pacification, and of course the whole project of ideas such as winning hearts and minds and so forth. And I think this is important because it's not just about winning a kind of ideological argument. It's actually about literally building things to the point where you constantly get this idea in the pacification literature that, well, just going in and killing people isn't enough, right? What we need to do is we need to build something. We need to build it in such a way that a new version of the enemy that we've just killed doesn't emerge. And so what do? Well, sometimes that means building roads, building markets, building houses, building clinics, building pharmacies, building hospitals, and building schools and so forth. And so you constantly get this idea that in the process of building these literal buildings or infrastructure, what we're also doing is building a whole set of relations that enable us to better police the community that we're building these things for, right? So you build schools, and therefore you need to build teachers. You build clinics, and so you need to build a medical system. You build apparatuses of social work, and therefore you need the social workers. And so you get this extension of the police machine in order to then hold the community, hold the territory, hold the people in place such that they won't become insurgent or they won't become seditious. And so, yep. So I was trying to stress this because I was trying to capture the what takes place in the prose of pacification as a productive process, right? The pacification has to be productive, And it has to produce all of these various things because what it's trying to do is to produce or constitute a particular type of order in which the insurgency won't occur. Of course, this creates a fundamental problem. There's is inherent, the kind of a Sisyphean task for the pacification people, which is what they don't understand is that in the process of building those things, they're often usually simultaneously building the insurgency. And they don't understand why people don't appreciate all of these things, right? Because they're like, well, we just built your hospital. It's like, yeah, but, you know. And you get this idea not just in well, you use the phrase soft colonialism, right? But you get this idea not just in the colonial context, right? You get this idea in, for example, the slogan or category of clear, hold, build, right? That you get in the counterinsurgency literature, the wider pacification literature, but also in the contemporary police literature. You know, that British police forces now are organizing themselves around this idea of clear, hold, build. Well, what does that mean? Well, in a certain context, it means clearing the area of insurgents, holding the area for good order, and then building this new area in which there won't be any more insurgency. And British police forces talk about clearing the area of criminality, holding the area for the good citizens, building a new community, right? So this idea of building is so central to the process of pacification and the exercise of police power that I think it needs that kind of level of analysis, that we need to pay more attention to it, right? And in other words, it's not just 6 million corpses, right? But it's, as you mentioned, right? It's, yeah, you can produce corpses, but you can also treat the people as a patient, right? Cure them of their giddiness, to go back to that point, right? Cure them of their various disorderly ideas, to the point where they become good, obedient subjects. So the people becomes it can become a corpse, but it's also a patient, right? To be treated, to be brought back to good political health.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into this. I want to ask you a question about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs, but just before we go to that, could you just say quickly, like, what oil stain theory is? Like, what does that metaphor explain to them?
Yeah, so this comes out of some of the pacification literature, which is that the insurgency or revolution spreads like oil, and what pacification practices can do is to spread equally as much so that it covers the whole territory, right? Because the thing about oil is that it will eventually cover the whole, or ink, it will eventually cover the whole territory.
Right on. Thank you.
It's not my idea, right? It's in the
I know that.
the old pacification literature. It's something they kept coming back to time and again.
So this part I really I really love this chapter that you have on, kind of the Vietnam era and thinking with a lot. There was obviously a lot going on at that time period in terms of, counterinsurgents getting together and having these conferences together and thinking about their ideas with each other and exchange of different countries. And one of the things you discuss is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, which, a lot of people would say, hey, these were good liberal programs, right? And I mean, they were, I guess. And and so they brought people jobs, they addressed social problems, quote unquote, all these things, right? But this could really be seen, as you show, and I think you show through the prose of certain people involved in pacification, as a form of pacification, or at least attempts within the United States, during the Vietnam War, which was at the same time very much thought of as a pacification war in Vietnam by the folks who were, enacting it. And so could you talk a little bit about this and how this example also kind of, as you talked about early, like helps show that it's not just what's going on over there and what's going on over here, right? But the thinking about these domestic programs and policies of Lyndon Johnson and how they might be understood as pacification as well.
Mm. Yeah, okay. I just want to take you back to where you started with this question, which was you said that you got a chapter on the period, the Vietnam period, and the Great Society period. And actually, I don't have a chapter on that, right? And I think what's interesting, and I was very conscious of needing to say what I needed to say about well, that period and that war, but also not wanting it to be about that period and that war. So it's interesting that that's how you've read it and assimilated it and thought about it. That's what's going on for you. So that discussion comes in the chapter about building, right? And I also have a discussion in the introduction about the emergence of counterinsurgency literature in the 1960s, which is then feeds into discussions about what the hell are we trying to do in Vietnam amongst the American elites and so forth, right?
Yeah. So just to clarify, yeah, it's the art of well building, right? Is the chapter that it comes up in.
Yeah. So I was trying to make it not about Vietnam, which is of course where a lot of people's minds go when they get the word pacification, understandably in lots of ways, of course. So I was trying to put it in the context of building, and that was the important step I was trying to make in that chapter of going, yeah, okay, so you can think about pacification through this particular war and what the Americans are doing in Vietnam. But I wanted to very quickly go, yeah, but it wasn't just about what was taking place in Vietnam. It was also what was taking place about in America, right? So in exactly the same way that actually, we didn't say much about it when you mentioned it a little while ago, but in exactly the same way that the pacification theorists, the French pacification theorists of the 19th century, imagine Algeria and Paris as one and the same problem, right? So the pacification theorists of the 60s and 70s are imagining the various areas of Indochina as one and the same problem as the problem of what's taking place in American cities, right? It's the same, right? It's the same problem. Now, one way to interpret, the Great Society program, for example, is as you've done, which is go, well, what's wrong? Right? It's a good liberal program, right? I think it's a good liberal program is the phrase you used. No, you're absolutely right. It is a brilliant liberal program. The problem is that brilliant liberal programs are pacification, right? They are pacificatory in their nature. Yeah, that's the problem. It's not that pacification is something else and that what we need is a good dose of liberalism. It's that pacification is fundamental to the liberal project, right? Because what else is building markets and building hospitals and building schools and training social workers and training teachers and training medical professionals and so forth, right? These are all good liberal things, right? Yeah, that's the problem, right?
Right on. So let's talk about the kettle. So you have a whole chapter. You kind of examine the practice of kettling, and you note how this is a very interesting section of like interviews and places where police are sort of confronted with this idea, and they say, well, there's no such thing. Like, this is not a police concept. We don't know what you're talking about. And yet they clearly do know what they're talking about, and they use the term containment instead. And which I think, as you kind of point out, and I agree with you, that's actually more useful in some ways for us to think about that, to think about the histories of containment and within military and police literature. And you go back and you look at the rise of that term with the Cold War, and how even for military folks, that they saw containment as about containing ideology and politics, even perhaps more so than they thought about it as containing a military threat. So could you say a little bit about that and kind of the implications that you see of that within pacification.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will get to that. I do think it's worth, since in a sense that idea about containment comes out of the discussion of the kettle, it might be worth just thinking about the kettle in relation to these conceptual couplets or these dichotomies that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, right? Because one of the interesting things that's come out of the British cases in containment is it touches on this idea of this entrenched dichotomy of coercion and consent. Yeah, and the legal cases in the UK at least have basically, I mean, assuming that we take kettling to be an act of coercion, right? In other words, you are not permitted to leave this space. You will stand there in the rain. You will get hungry. You will piss yourselves, and then we'll send you home, right? If we take that as an act of coercion, what's interesting about the legal cases is that in the UK is that they've basically said, well, what we can do is we can think about this as imputed consent, right? That the people going on the marches that are then contained have given their consent to be contained, have given their consent to be kettled by going on the marches, right? In other words, that's basically what you're consenting to if you actually engage in anything that's remotely seditious. And so immediately that conceptual couplet disappears, right? It's basically you have consented to your coercion. You have consented to be coerced by the British police. So again, it's one of those conceptual couplets that really is problematic and should probably be abandoned. I mean, I realize lots of Gramscians would object to that, but let's leave those aside for a moment. Yeah, so the idea of the kettle there is, I mean, I was intrigued by these senior police officers constantly saying, no, we don't kettle, we don't recognize it, it's not a term in our language, what we do is contain people. And so the idea there is to think, well, okay, what is being contained? Well, it's people, individuals, but it's people mobilizing for something or another. In other words, engaging in whatever, sedition, insurgency, resistance, politics, stasis, taking sides in a conflict, right? Even to the extent of, you might describe them as being good citizens, right? And challenging and questioning and resisting and so forth. And so they're contained, right? And out of that, we can perhaps think about that containment as a message, right? This is the very least that will happen to you should you decide to rebel, right? Even that minimal level of resistance is, yeah, okay, you can do this, but you need to be prepared to be held in situ for hours on end in all sorts of weather. And so, yeah, okay, so there's a message there, right? Think twice. Yeah. But I think if we spiral out from that, when we think about the politics of containment more generally, we get interesting connections, right? Because what was containment about? Well, interestingly, it's invented as an idea, really. I mean, it has a longer history, but it becomes a core political idea around about the same time as counterinsurgency. Right? And so there's an interesting connection there. But also, what is being contained? Well, in one sense, yes, it's the Soviet Union and its satellite states and so forth. But in another sense, it was quite obvious from that containment literature that what is being contained is any kind of political dissidence within the body politic itself, within, to go back to those dichotomies, right? The metropole or the domestic scene. And so what I try and do in that chapter is to think about the kettle as a kind of microcosm of containment, a microcosm of the larger containment that is the project of pacification. That this is about the state finding ways to contain any kind of resistance, any kind of rebellion, any kind of sedition, and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to bring in an audience question. So Orasami Burton asked, he would love to hear you talk about the constant failure of pacification to achieve decisive victories. If we think about, pacification or counterinsurgency wars that don't seem to play out, at least the way that they seem to have certain objectives which never quite get met. Um, Coupled with the constant reformulation and regurgitation of new approaches, there's always a new approaches, new ideas of how to do counterinsurgency.
Mm,
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
mm. So, I mean, I think you're right. There is this constant. We need to rethink. We need to rethink. We need to rethink. We need another manual. We need another police manual, counterinsurgency manual, military manual, and so forth. Right? That's absolutely true. I think what's interesting about that constant rethinking is how often it's the case that there's not that much that is new in a lot of that literature. So if you take that key text now, the counterinsurgency manual, the U.S. Army and Marines counterinsurgency manual, it's remarkable, right? That there's so much there that you just think, well, I mean, even the manual itself says, well, yeah, it's kind of like pacification, like we were trying before, right? Yeah, several hundred pages and you go, this is something we were trying in Vietnam, for example. So there is a kind of, there's a sense in which the newness often masks the fact that they haven't got anything new to say. But I'm also intrigued by the start of your question, which has now disappeared from the screen, which was about pacification's inability to failure to achieve decisive victories. I think that's interesting because there's a sense in which, well, I guess two things. One is in a sense, pacification has achieved its decisive victory, which is we're still going out to work for a wage, not resisting very much, sitting around worrying about our various insecurities, facing our debt, which we might get onto if Jared, you want to, and also our death in the conditions in which we are living. And that's for the best of us, right? For many people, there are still, what is it, 1 million children struggling, 1 million children dying a year from diarrhea, for example, countless millions of people going without fresh water. We have food mountains and starvation, never mind, genocide in parts of the world, right? The fact that this is our normal, in a sense, is pacification's victory, right? It's the decisive victory. Within that, of course, there is a sense in which I know what you're getting at. You're right. Yeah, there is no decisive victory because, and this is, if you like, the second side is that what pacification does is it does generate insurgency, right? That it's the counterinsurgency. It's the counterinsurgency that creates the insurgency. Insurgency here can be thought of as whatever you might prefer: resistance, rebellion, if you like, revolution. So in that sense, yes, there is no decisive victory. It is constantly having to fight the same fight. It might recreate manuals and documents that it describes as new but aren't very new, and that makes it an ongoing process, right? It is permanent because, of course, it is integral to the constitution of a capitalist order.
Yeah, thank you. So let's get into debt. So you have a chapter, you deal with debt. Some of my comrades as well, we've been thinking about this concept of risk a lot lately too. And thinking about risk, which you do bring in risk, partly through thinking about security. And we can think about risk there's a few different ways you can think about risk. Obviously, you can think about risk in terms of how, corporations, manage it. This idea of risk management, which bleeds into, even structures like nonprofits, which a lot of our, social movements now are very involved with nonprofits, as opposed to the past where, it would be, some type of revolutionary organization often, and so on, and it wouldn't necessarily fit within a nice, legal structure.
Mm,
Um, and then there's also just thinking about risk aversion, which I think is something that we can think about as on an individual basis, of, again, to use your thinking around security, right? And insecurity. And, I feel like with, with my generation and generations below, that, this is always something that comes up, and maybe it always has, but, like, as you're thinking about what action do we want to do, what do we want to do, there's always kind of a calculus of avoiding risk, right? Of not wanting to put certain people at risk, and so on. And so there's that. I know I'm getting kind of convoluted here. But I think about this risk aversion as a kind of form of a kind of logic of self-pacification in a certain way.
mm,
And with debt, there's also the way that, and you're right, there's a lot about debt we could dig into within the book. I mean, maybe we should go there first. But there's with that, I also think about it as a way of that the ruling class kind of offloads its own financial risk onto all of us who are actually sort of productive within the society, um,
mm,
and onto working class and poor people. And they're sold these products, uh, you know, then, as you point out, when you produce insecurity, then you're sold security projects. You're sold things
mm,
to mitigate this. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, we can go either way here. I mean, there's also a very interesting history of debt within the book, and within it, the period at which, like, usury, and debt was associated with, well, basically, it was seen as a sin, right? To collect a lot of interest from people, which gets, as you point out, worked out, in a certain period of history. So I know this is sort of all over, but these are all the different thoughts that are in my head as I'm reading this stuff.
yeah, yeah, okay. Um, so it feels like a question of that goes. You write about debt a lot, and that's really interesting. But why don't you write more about risk or something like that, right? Or is it to do with the risk of debt or something? Or maybe
Well,
maybe I shouldn't ask you again because you might.
I think so. I think there's a relationship,
Right.
which is in part that, obviously, debt is something that's often sold to us as producing certain securities, right? It's often like,
Mm-hmm.
you can get a mortgage and then you can have a house. You can get an auto
Yeah.
loan and then you can have a car, and you know and then yet you can get an education, right? But then you're going to have student loans for the rest of your
Mm-hmm.
life or whatever. And these things are often seen as the ways that you're going to have, access to more, and a better career and all of these things. And yet you're obviously burdening yourself with a lot of debt,
Mm-hmm.
which has its own risks associated with it as well.
Yeah. And
So yeah,
insecurities. And
yeah, yeah.
insecurities, because you never know when the debt's going to be demanded or how much it might go up by, and when the interest rates change and so forth. Yeah, okay. I mean, so look, there is obviously an integral connection between debt and risk, which is that both are fundamental to capitalism, right? That capitalism is about risk, that it's about the capitalists saying they're taking the risk and so forth, and therefore trying to educate the rest of us that we need to take on some of the risks to be good capitalist subjects. And obviously debt is central to capitalism, which is one of the things that I try and explore in that chapter. I mean, in relation to debt, what I was intrigued by is a number of things. I mean, one is the ways in which the literature on pacification constantly talks about money, right? That, for all of the discussion that we've had about death, for example, what it seems to be doing is trying to create good, active financial subjects, right? So you get these phrases in the literature such as money as a weapons system, right? And it's like, well, what kind of weapon is this money, right? Well, let's think about this in terms of what they're trying to get us to imagine, what practices they're referring to when they're talking about money in that way. One of the things I was trying to do is to think about debt, think about kind of the centrality of the debt form to the money form now, that it's almost as important as the wage form in our pacification, right? That clearly there is, the wage form is fundamental, but there is also something about debt that is central to our pacification, that it binds us, that we're encouraged to take on certain kinds of debts for all sorts of reasons, not least to do with security, which then generate more insecurities, and so forth, in a way that then makes us start imagining death, that there's a connection between debt and death, not least, when we imagine our mortgage or imagine our student loans and so forth. It's like they're going to pay this off. But also in terms of things such as the weightiness, right? The weight of debt. The language of debt is very much about the weight of the debt on my being, right? This is something from which I cannot escape. It's too heavy a burden, and so forth. That there's something about debt which is essentially pacifying, which is precisely why the pacification literature talks about money, because what it wants to do is to not simply constitute people as wage laborers, but it wants to constitute us as indebted subjects, as wage laborers, right? If there's one thing you can do to guarantee people going out to work for a wage, is to get them into debt, right? So that's what I was trying to do in relation to debt. I mean, I'm intrigued by the way that you think that I do talk about risk, because I didn't think I did say very much about risk. So that's interesting in terms of how you've read it. I mean, risk is a kind of, I mean, I think in one sense I'm kind of slightly averse to the sort of, if you like, the sociological banality of the language of risk now, that it's become so entrenched in a certain kind of mode of contemporary sociology that it becomes kind of almost pointless saying it. A lot of that contemporary sociological thinking about risk doesn't really get to some of the centrality of its history in the development of capitalism.
Yeah.
I guess where it's
it doesn't show up. When I do a word search within the book, it doesn't show up much. The place where it does show up partly is through the work of others. So it's
yeah,
mainly in the part where you're looking at like insecurity studies and stuff like that. And so
yeah,
in some of the footnotes and things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, but you see, I think there is something interesting about risk that I don't deal with in the book, but actually I could have done. So actually you might be getting onto something important here that I missed, which is that I guess what's interesting about the language of risk now is not just its centrality to capitalism, but also its centrality to policing, to police power, right? That police, I'm trying to connect risk to what in the book I call social police, right? That risk is one of the ways in which the kind of professional police forces connect with and intersect with and support and develop the forces of the wider police machine, right? That risk is is a way of somehow kind of unifying the various police mechanisms, right? The uniformed police, the professional police, do a risk analysis, and because the risk analysis touches on these particular aspects of the social field, this is why we have to go into schools, right? This is why we have to work with social workers. This is why we should insist that medical professionals inform us of certain things, right? That the police, in a sense, what's interesting is not so much the idea of risk, but is the policing of risk.
Yeah.
I mean, in that sense, I mean, I'm going back now thinking about it. I think this is you know, there's a great book by Richard Erickson and Kevin Haggerty from many years ago, 20 odd years ago, called Policing the Risk Society, which is kind of makes this argument, right, that actually risk is we should think about risk not, if you like, let's abandon the sociology of risk and think about what is going on when risk is being policed. Right? What
Yeah, no, it's really interesting.
when aspects of the social world are articulated as forms of risk, what is expected to step in, and what's expected to step in is various parts of the police machine.
Yeah, and it's and also, I mean, I think part of the interest for me with risk is the way that it connects in like management literature, which is also very much bound up with
Yeah,
counterinsurgency,
yeah.
you know, and pacification and these things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you know, I mean, there's the whole relationship between risk and probable cause, or like police activity, and like, you know, there's all these kind of interesting areas. But yeah, the let's there was something that you brought up that I want to go back to that we didn't really delve into deeply in this conversation, um which was, you were just talking about, oh man, um well, let's go, well, maybe while I think about it, let's go to debt for a little bit. So could you just talk a little bit about the usury and this history, and when it changes, you know, and kind of a little bit of that struggle around the change of usury.
Yeah. So I was intrigued that that we have this history of this idea of usury of well, it's hard to pin down precisely what usury is, but essentially, because a lot of time for a lot of people it just folds into debt, but it tends to mean debt that is accruing very high amounts of interest. Now, some people just use them interchangeably because they say, well, even basic levels of debt are usurious, in the sense that even 4% is too much, right? But there's a long history going back to Aristotle, through the whole history of the big religions over the centuries, which thoroughly condemned usury, right? That this is something that you really, this is a terrible thing, right? It's immoral, it's unethical, because it's essentially ripping off the poor, right? That you get poor people into a small amount of debt and then they can't pay off the debt because the interest rate is so high, and you're essentially, it's a form of exploitation, you know? And then capitalism comes along, right? And you get a kind of period of roughly 100 years with the development of early capitalism, in which there's a series of debates that take place within the ruling class, about whether it is appropriate for the state to regulate interest rates. And of course, the good liberal, to go back to our discussion there about the liberal project, right? The progressive project says, well, it's ridiculous for the state to try and do this, right? It's basically a form of contract, and people are consenting, and if they consent to an interest rate of 100% or 200% or whatever, then that's their choice, right? Why would you take that away? And so by 1900 or so, you've gone from a period of sort of 200 years in which you've gone from usury, right, the charging of high interest rates, being absolutely condemned by the major philosophers, the major religions, and of course the poor, the working class, right, to its complete legalization by 1900 or so. Yeah. And out of that, of course, you get a whole history of banking, but also loan sharks and the like. Yeah. And that tells us something important about capitalism. I think it tells us that capitalism thinks that these things shouldn't be regulated. It also tells us that capitalism really doesn't mind and might actually enjoy us being indebted subjects, that there might be something important to our indebtedness that capitalism thrives on.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I remembered the other part that you brought up that I did want to make sure we touch on. I do have to leave in a few minutes. This has been a great conversation. Thank you. But you've mentioned a couple of times, and this is an important theme in your book of hospitals and hospital work and building, right? And one of the moments that you kind of grapple with a little bit in the book, and as a way of kind of talking about this, is the post George Floyd moment, and the discussions around defund, or as some people might say, like divest and reinvest, or this kind of thinking, and the idea we should take some money away from police and give it to more social workers, or give it bring in other state workers who are not doing police work that can help, that do work that helps out poor folks in need, and so on. And as you point out, even among folks within social work, they said there's some problems with just thinking about things in these terms, because social work, we go right along with police bring us along with this, and so just talk a little bit about, maybe some of these other aspects of the state outside of policing, and, the way you're thinking about them within pacification in the book and the relationships there.
Yeah, so obviously I didn't do my job well enough, because you said, can you talk about these aspects of the state outside of policing? And the point is, they're not outside of policing, right? So this is why this idea of social police is important, right? Because we need a concept of police that isn't just the uniformed police, which is what I think you meant by outside of policing. But it's interesting how entrenched
100%.
it is in our minds, right? That's what we think of. And so what this idea of social police does is it's meant to connect up with the idea of social war, right? Because the whole point is the social wars are conducted through the police machine, but the police machine isn't just the uniformed police. Obviously, the uniformed police are integral, but the police machine also involves the various other organizations that you're talking about, such as, for example, social work. And so that's where I butt up against some of the abolitionist or defunding politics, which is that a lot of that, as you've just said, it says, well, let's take the money from the police and put it into social work, right? Or let's abolish the police and have more mental health workers. Unfortunately, I think that involves a kind of what is essentially a kind of uncritical way of thinking about social work or mental health, for example. That actually we need to think about these in terms of how they are connected up with or part of the whole machine of social police. And those, to go back to debt, right? This is a way of also trying to think about abolitionist politics more broadly, right? That there's a very strong, entrenched, developing, powerful police abolitionist movement, which has got very close connections with prison abolition and so forth, right? But we also need to think about, for example, debt abolition, right? These are movements that are connected, and we need to think about intellectually, politically, in terms of how they're connected. Which is why that book that you mentioned earlier, that came out last year, is called the Security Abolition Manifesto. Right? There's something about these forms of pacification, police, prison, debt, that that are deeply connected, and our argument in that manifesto is that actually what we need to avoid doing is we need to avoid thinking about, reinventing security mechanisms, right? That's not the issue for us, right? Let's not abolish the police and recreate some other kind of security institutions. Let's imagine a world beyond security, which is for us about imagining a world beyond police.
I really appreciate that work because it was one of the things, and I got into some arguments with folks about it around that time too, of like there was a lot of like reimagine public safety, reimagine security, and these things, thinking about, without police. And well, I think the exercises of getting people together and reimagining society and thinking about what they actually would want and all of that is very important and useful. So I don't want to like negate the importance of a lot of the
No,
kind of
sure,
projects that might have
absolutely.
happened. But at the same time, I was like, in the United States, often the Department of Public Safety literally means like the prison system, or it literally means like, the
Yeah,
state police or something like that. And so
sure.
these concepts are so deeply entwined and intermingled and so deeply co-constitutive too within our consciousness that it becomes
Sure.
very difficult to just kind of, you know, to start to have a conversation about this without suddenly kind of replicating things that we
Yeah,
already experience as these phenomenon. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, Mark Neocleous, thank you so much for this discussion. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
No, Jared, I just no, just a big thank you for your time and your interest and reading the book and engaging with it. It's been really, really useful and interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the book is Pacification, Social War, and the Power of Police. I really encourage people to check it out. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cheers.